Thank you very much for the very gracious introduction. Let me just say it's wonderful to be back in Taiwan and to be among so many good friends. I'd like to thank the Taiwan Brain Trust. I'd like to thank all the colleagues who are working together to think about and conceptualize about policies that will promote peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. Before I get started, there's so many colleagues here that I worked with in the State Department and friends in the Taiwan government. I do want to just say a word, if I might, about two very, very good friends in a bipartisan spirit who have served our country in different ways very substantially. I want to thank Frank Januzzi, a dear friend who's worked in many aspects of government and currently serves as the head of the Mansfield Foundation, is taking steps in a nonprofit environment to support very deep American engagement, not just in Japan, but across Asia as a whole. Frank, you're a good friend to the region and to me. Thank you for being here. I also want to say a good bit about my dear friend and compatriot of many years, Randy Schreiber. I had the great honor of working with Randy in the Pentagon when I served there in the 1990s. No more able, better friend have I ever had. Just a tremendous supporter of Taiwan, but more importantly, a strong supporter of deep American engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. The reason why I picked these two individuals out, ladies and gentlemen, is that they represent different political parties, Democrats in America and Republicans in the United States, but they also represent the best aspects of bipartisanship. And we're heading into a very difficult period in the United States, and the hope is that we will be able to sustain a degree of bipartisanship in the Asia-Pacific region, because in many respects, it is in fact that bipartisanship that has given us some unique advantages going forward. But as you will hear through my discussion this afternoon, and I'll try to be brief, and I'm very interested to take questions, bipartisanship, the very foundations of American foreign policy and national security are under pressure as we've seen the likes not very intense over about 40 or 50 years. We're entering a period in which the stresses and strains on the American engagement international environment are much greater than we've seen in the past. So let me begin a discussion this afternoon with a proposition that is so familiar and well known to all of you, and I don't think it will be in any way controversial. And that is that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Asia-Pacific region. And that without doubt that because of driving innovation, rising nationalisms, competition for power, the rise of great powers more generally, it is going to be in this region that the defining issues of the 21st century will play out. And I must say, as much as I would like to suggest that this is not the case, but you would not necessarily know this if you looked at the trajectory of American foreign policy and national security over the last 15 years. It is true that we've enunciated a strategy of a rebalance or pivot, but even to this day, the remarkable challenges that we face in the United States, the Middle East, and South Asia absorbs the just an enormity of American time and attention and money. And one of the great challenges of diplomacy going forward in the short term is to try to find the wit and wisdom to find spare capacities to address towards the Asia-Pacific region. But over time, fundamentally, we begin a careful and responsible shift more towards the Asia-Pacific region. At the beginning of the Obama administration, American politics with respect to Asia was subjected to one of these ridiculous back and forths between Democrats and Republicans. And it went something like this, with Democrats saying we are back in Asia, and Republicans saying, you know what, we've never left Asia. And the truth is that both, in many respects, are wrong. For us to be truly, quote, back in Asia after a period of remarkable investment in the Middle East and South Asia will take much more than one administration. It will take several, and it will take a very concerted effort in the national security, foreign policy, and economic establishment to suggest that we are making that transition. On the other hand, to those who say that we've never left Asia, it is true that we have a very strong and deep foundation in the Asia-Pacific region. But because the stakes and the engagement issues in Asia have risen so dramatically in such a short period of time, what is expected from the United States has also risen commensurately in a relationship way. So as a result, what used to pass as an effective American engagement 10 or 15 years ago no longer suffices. We need a much more sustained, deeper engagement going forward. And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping to see sustained in the next administration, whether it's Republican or Democratic. Let me just say that if you are in Washington currently and you're looking at the environment, you see just an enormous number of international challenges. You see the drama that is playing out in Syria, in Afghanistan. You see the challenges between Russia and Ukraine, a number of other swirling difficulties in the Middle East and elsewhere. These issues, combined with challenges in Asia, present the President and his team and Congress with some of the most difficult, vexing problems on the national security front that we've seen in decades. And each of these issues provide no easy answers, and they will take more time and attention for this president in going forward. I think one of President Obama's hopes was to be able to, quote, end two wars on his watch in Afghanistan and Iraq. But if anything, we are seeing a set of circumstances in Iraq that will require a longer-term investment, and as importantly, the situation in Afghanistan appears to require greater and longer-term stability than many had anticipated just a couple of years ago. And so campaign rhetoric is colliding in many respects with the realities on the ground in Middle East and South Asia. But despite these international challenges, ladies and gentlemen, I would offer and proffer to you that the biggest challenges that the United States faces are really not on the international front. They are really domestically in the United States. And these are not the typical issues about concerns of American decline that pervade diplomacy and discussion and backroom anxieties across Asia. If anything, the recent job report that was published this morning suggests that again, that the United States represents the driving force in the global economy, with softening in Europe and even some uncertainty in China. No, the real concerns are the foundational aspects that have essentially driven American foreign policy and national security for 50 years. So let me give you a sense of what I'm describing here. Essentially, the Democratic Party since the 1960s, since Vietnam, has been profoundly divided between one group that is frankly deeply suspicious of American power, concerned about cyber issues and interested in individual issues, and frankly wary of dominant bureaucratic interests. And then the other part of the Democratic Party, the internationalists, supporting of trade and strong defense. That group of the Democratic Party has essentially made, over the course of the last 50 years, an uneasy alliance with the vast majority of the Republican Party. And that alliance, although tested at times and occasionally difficult, is around several key propositions. Free and fair trade, strong defense, foreign policy commitments, the importance of strategic partnerships, and in places like Taiwan, supporting peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, a responsible defense engagement between Washington and Taipei, right? Those foundational aspects have essentially set the scene for American engagement in the world over the last 50 years. But what has happened, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm afraid this is a phenomenon as we live through it that we are not understanding as effectively as we might. The Republican Party is now as divided as the Democratic Party, right? And that there is an element in the Republican Party that has deep misgivings about certain aspects of American engagement globally, and are raising questions about spending money and entanglements abroad. Now, there is a tendency among elite commentators to dismiss this as kind of wacko politics, and that is deeply inappropriate. These men and women represent a powerful tradition in American foreign policy that has been unfairly described as isolationist, but really is much more about an anxiety about certain kinds of American engagement in the world. And so despite sort of last-minute polling that suggests the United States wants to get behind a more robust engagement in, for instance, Syria, after horrible visions of beheadings and the like, any fundamental polling reveals that in many respects the Republican Party has divided in two, between the internationalist Republicans and what you might call your father's Oldsmobile Republicans, and a group of people that are very suspicious of American engagement in the world, worried about defense budgets, anxious about international surveillance, all of those issues. And so what we have now is not just divisions between the parties, but much more importantly within the parties. And what that requires, more than anything else, is a set of internal diplomacy between the internationalist Democrats and internationalist Republicans to sustain certain aspects of American engagement, Trans-Pacific Partnership, issues associated with the defense budget and the like. And what we have seen is, ironically, an environment where the left of the Democratic Party and the right of the Republican Party are actually finding it quite easy to define terms where they can cooperate to undermine the consensus in foreign policy and national security. Now, the only problem here, this is my perspective, Randy or others may have a different. I think internationalist Democrats are prepared to cut those deals and to work in harmony and to try to find a way forward with moderate Republicans. But most moderate Republicans are not yet comfortable with those kinds of engagements. And given a choice between working with Democrats or basically protecting your flank on the right, most will choose the latter. And so our environment today, ladies and gentlemen, is much more unsteady with respect to our foreign policy and national security engagements. And I would add just another factor just to keep in mind. One of the key features of American life in recent years is a growing inequality between just the remarkably rich and everyone else. And I think one of the aspects of America that has been most attractive to countries, highly stratified societies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia was a thriving and strong American middle class. And that middle class in the United States is now under pressure as if never before. They don't have enough money to buy a house, send their kids to college. Most polling suggests that over time, in these circumstances, with wages stagnating, that everyday Americans have deep concerns about spending money on foreign policy and national security. They start to worry that this is an indulgence that we can no longer afford. And so sort of complementing the difficulties between Republicans and Democrats inside the party are pressures societally in the United States which make it more difficult to sustain an international narrative. And so as much as we want to talk about all the challenges of Asia, let us remember that the stabilizing role, the strong role of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region is probably the most important factor in the maintenance of peace and stability going forward in the next 30 or 40 years. Now, I believe one of the reasons why Asia is so important to the United States is that it is one of the few areas that actually addresses some of the divisions inside the United States. The idea of a strong region that wants American leadership is not particularly ambivalent about wanting a strong American role. A recognition that the only way out of our domestic problems is to boost fundamentally exports to the Asia-Pacific region, creating partnerships that will allow the United States to take advantage of a surge in more efficient goods and services. This is why I believe that the way for the United States to articulate a stronger role in the world is to focus more of our time and attention on talking about Asia, than any of the other regions on the global scene. Now, I will tell you, several years ago when I worked for Secretary Clinton, we articulated an agenda. It was described at that time as the pivot. These are one of these circumstances that are difficult to anticipate. When we helped her write a sort of a series of speeches and articles for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, the editors decided to take from the part of our piece, rather than the term rebalance, they took the term pivot and put that in the title. And so there was, for a while, this sort of debate among a certain group of people in Washington about whether the term rebalance or pivot was better or worse, right? And I was in the pivot camp, although I like the term rebalance, and I understand the psychological dimension. Rebalance sounds more subtle, more incremental. The idea behind pivot was like a pivot in a basketball player's stance. You could kind of move back and forth, but unfortunately, I think it led to a view that we were somehow moving fundamentally away from our European allies. Anyone who knows anything about American foreign policy understands that everything the United States has ever done of significance in the last 60 years, we've done with Europeans, and that will be the case in Asia as well. So sending that message was deeply inappropriate. Frankly, I've got to take some responsibility for that, for the rollout. My only defense would be, I've worked in government a bit. 99 times out of 100, when you roll out a big idea, it disappears immediately. And no one focuses on it, no one's interested, and you just go on. You try to point it out, and people are like, I'm not interested in this at all. On the rare occasions you roll out a big idea and it takes off in a way that you did not anticipate, then you immediately have to deal with the unintended consequences of that rollout. And I remember after staying up all night writing these sections of the Secretary's speech, obviously they were edited subsequently, but people would come up to me and treat these like biblical phrases. What exactly did you mean by this exact phrase? And I was always like, I wrote it in the middle of the night on a flight back from Tokyo. I'm not sure I remember. But in truth, the idea and the concept really was just to articulate that we needed to redirect American foreign policy and national security more towards Asia. And frankly, we needed to do it with partners as well, right? So that's the essential dynamic that we sought to lay out. And frankly, it's faced, I think, some challenges with respect to enduring problems in the Middle East, which we've already discussed. But I still believe that the United States is inexorably in the process of redirecting our foreign policy and national security towards the Asia-Pacific region. So what are we experiencing in Asia right now? It is the most dramatic set of events in the last several years. We have tensions over maritime security. We have enormous economic opportunities and challenges. We have the coexistence of the most rapidly rising states on the international scene, China and India, the most challenging, declining, provocative states in North Korea. We have countries that are flirting with democracy, like Myanmar, Burma, and others who had reached that example and then have fallen back, like in Thailand. And we have some of the most powerful, interesting, but controversial economic and commercial diplomacy of modern times, what has taken place between China and Taiwan. One of the most remarkable things that has changed from my period when Randy and I worked together in the Pentagon in the 1990s, at the top of the list of our concerns on a daily basis was the worry that through some miscalculation or provocation, we could see overnight tensions rise across the Taiwan Straits. I will tell you today, of course that's on everyone's, at the back of people's minds, but today people tend to look at the dynamic that has taken place between China and Taiwan, and frankly, also between the United States quietly and Taiwan and the United States and China. It has been more a virtual triangle of late, is a generally stabilizing set of circumstances that has, if anything, led to quiet arenas of confidence in various parts of Asia as a whole. So it's an extraordinarily dynamic region, and it's a region that, frankly, I think more than in many times in the past, wants the United States deeply engaged. I would say, just as we look at American strategy going forward, I think we have to acknowledge at the outset what are some of the challenges that the United States faces conceptually with respect to dealing with Asia. And let me just say, if you were to define what's the worst possible preparation for dealing with the subtleties and sophistication of Asia, you would say, well, look, that would be 50 years of Cold War, which we had with the Soviet Union, black or white, good or bad, using concepts like containment, right? And followed by 15 years of Marshall campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the United States has had a residue, an echo of engagement that is not particularly attuned to some of the challenges that we're going to face in the Asia-Pacific region. And we need to recognize, as important as everything is in terms of military and defense issues in Asia, diplomacy really is where the most important maneuvering is taking place in Asia, backed up by creative commercial engagement as a whole. So the first challenge, again, is our history. Even though we have a strong history of engagement as in Asia as a whole, our dominant experience in the Cold War, followed by military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, are not ideal preparations for what we're facing going forward. The other thing that I must say, I gave you two examples, there are others, great Foreign Service officers in the crowd. In truth, if you ask me to identify the key players inside the U.S. government on foreign policy issues, I could show you a large number of 4-stars, extraordinarily able diplomats, other intelligence players who could tell you how to build a civil society well in Helmand province in Afghanistan, or could negotiate a very complex truce between two tribal groups in Iraq. And the newspapers are filled with these names: General Mattis, General McChrystal, General Petraeus, right? So these have been the dominant players in our foreign policy and national security establishment. If you ask me honestly to identify other senior people in the military and the intelligence and the diplomatic corps, very, very senior, with a comparable experience in Asia, I'm not sure I could do it. I'm not sure I could do it. And that's bad on us. So we have not invested. We have now at the middle levels, but not at the senior levels, in the kind of capacity that's going to be necessary to be successful on the Asia-Pacific scene in terms of experience and capability. Now, I won't run through our current cabinet, but I will just tell you of the most critical players in Washington, several cabinet members, several key players in the military have never been to Asia, had never been to China before taking these jobs. You can find people on the street with more experience. and these are very able people, but it's hard when you just arrive in these positions to be expected to understand the nuances involved. And so a degree of training and investment is absolutely essential going forward. And that's one of the things, frankly, that this environment and bringing people to these kinds of discussions is so critical. So first is this experience. Second is the issue of the internal capacity at a time. Trust me, when you go into the Situation Room, and this has been the case now for 15 years, the urgent crowds out the important. The amount of time that we spend talking about bombing routes in Afghanistan or what we need to do in Iraq. These are important issues, undeniably, but they crowd out some of the most important things that we need to be doing in terms of preparing the way for the 21st century in Asia as a whole. And then I would tell you, from my perspective, one of the most important things for the United States going forward, ladies and gentlemen, is to have the dominant group of Asianists. And this is a small group of people. It is not a large group. It is probably no more than about 50 or 60 people. But to settle fundamentally on the foundations of what our strategy in Asia should be going forward. And I want to take a moment to give you a sense of what I've seen in terms of the back and forth of how strategy on Asia has shifted and moved over the last 15 or 20 years. I would say, generally speaking, there are a couple of schools of thought, and they generally coexisted, but they fall into these categories. Probably the first school, the most prominent school in foreign policy and national security in Asia, is the school that believes that if you get China right, that everything else will follow accordingly. And there's a romance to this. It's Kissingerian, it's secretive, it's embedded in the White House, right? And almost every national security advisor and every presidential office has been animated by these perceptions. And this is not Republican and Democrat. In fact, the dominant players in this are probably on the Republican side, but it is shared across the board. Now, I think one of the challenges of that approach is that it tends to replicate the tributary qualities of traditional Chinese diplomacy, and it frankly makes other friends in the region uncomfortable. The second school of thought really might be described as your allied school, and Randy Shriver's talked about this as out-in as opposed to in-out. What that means is that this is a group of people that argue that the best way to deal with issues that potentially threaten peace and stability, uncertainty on the Korean Peninsula, challenges across the Taiwan Straits, even transnational challenges across the Asia-Pacific region due to disease or climate change, is through the maintenance of strong allied relationships. And there are some key players in this school as well, Rich Armitage, Joe Nye. But it's not as sexy. It's not, alliance relationships require a lot of nuts and bolts. And you don't get to have these soaring strategic conversations that are sort of the stuff of legend in the U.S.-China circumstances. These two groups have generally coexisted, but they represent very different perspectives more generally. And then there are a couple of other schools that have also risen up. There was a period during the Bush administration of a third school that really began to articulate more clearly the idea that China was an enemy, not a nuanced set of circumstances. I don't think that's a dominant school, although quietly there are groups that believe that that is the coming trend. And then there are other people that have argued, look, the key issues in Asia have been either Indonesia or Cambodia or North Korea. They've tended to basically operate and structure their engagement around these issues to sort of tip and spin big relationships towards these specific goals. And then finally, there are probably a group of people that say, look, these schools are hopelessly 19th century, and that the real challenges of Asia are multilateral and they are transnational, like climate change, and that they threaten all of us and we must cooperate together. Now, what we try to do, and what I try to work on now substantially for a period of time, is to conceptualize a approach to Asia that combines certain key features of several of these schools, but recognizes that for the United States to be effective, each of these schools in isolation is no longer sufficient. And so what Secretary Clinton, what others, Randy, many people have tried to do is put forward a comprehensive American engagement strategy that will be enduring. And what I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, is just give you what I think the foundational aspects of those approaches would be and how the United States could be successful going forward. First and foremost, I believe, is a recognition at the top of the list is maintaining our strong allied relationships in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan, South Korea, Australia. You're going to see more focus on the Philippines going forward. Thailand is difficult given its domestic circumstances, but you will also see more engagement with what I might call quasi-allies, countries that we work very closely in the security arena, and I would put countries like Singapore, and I would also talk about our unofficial relationship with Taiwan in this category. These relationships, people have said in the past that these alliances belong on the ash heap of history. I completely disagree. They are relevant. We can build other institutional engagements on this strong foundation, and it is through these relationships that are based on values, on shared interests, that the United States has the ability to project power diplomatically and militarily.
And we need to realize that, and we need to take steps to sustain these relationships. And that means giving our allied friends the same face and engagement and time and attention that we traditionally give to Chinese friends. Trust me when I tell you, I spent a lot of time in Asia. Even though Asian friends are often very discreet about this, they note that Chinese and other friends get an enormous amount of attention, and they want to have the same kind of respect and time shown to them by American friends, particularly those countries that have given so much to sustain these bilateral relationships. So I would put number one, the bilateral security and political ties at the top of the list. Number two, a recognition, and everyone needs to understand this, everyone in Asia wants a better relationship with China, everyone, including the United States. And so we need to construct a more durable, stable relationship between the United States and China, but we also must recognize that we're heading into a period where, unfortunately, but inevitably, U.S.-China relations are going to be more difficult, and there's going to be more tension in the relationship. And in fact, an absence of tension or an absence of occasional friction most likely means that someone is not doing their job, because there are critical issues where the United States and China will continue to disagree. But the key is to find those areas where we need to cooperate and to match that with areas of common pursuit. So for instance, the reason that I was so pleased by President Obama's visit to China most recently is we did not spend as much time on what I would call the banner headlines of what a great power relationship is. We spent more time trying to build concrete habits of cooperation. On the mill-to-mill side, again, another legacy of Randy's. Stuff that we've done on technology. This is what we need to do between the United States and China. We must demonstrate to countries in the region and to ourselves that this relationship is important, and we must work towards building cooperation. I will tell you, my own personal experience is that it is very difficult to get China to actually cooperate in areas that are in both of our strategic interests, whether it's assistance programs in Southeast Asia or the Lower Mekong, or dealing with the profound issues associated with storm surges as a result of climate change, right? Those are the areas that the United States and China must work on going forward. And on the military side, I think there is now a recognition on both sides that the United States and China have real risks as China's forces rub up against American forces. Escalation and inadvertence are much more likely than they have been in the past. And taking responsible steps to try to prevent that, or, if necessary, to respond if there is a crisis, that is extraordinarily important. At the same time, we have to recognize that China is entering a new phase. The diplomacy between the United States and China is different than it has been in the past. I often find myself in circumstances, this year is the 40th anniversary of the opening, sort of the last hurrah of the initial architects. And when you meet with them, they often kind of look at you and you get the sense that they think, probably rightly, that they manage the relationship with China more effectively. But I will say, the choices that you use in trying to lure out a country from self-chosen isolation and poverty 40 years ago, and you compare them with the choices that you have to make today with shaping the opportunities and the choices of the most rapidly rising country in history, right? Very different. And so the challenges are enormous. And I would say the other aspect of diplomacy that's more important is that when you do this collective diplomacy in Asia, part of it is a focus on China. It is not containment, but it is a recognition that we have a better shot at changing subtle Chinese views on macroeconomic policy or cybersecurity issues when China is confronted or engaged by a group of countries or firms, all of whom are sharing similar perspectives. So one, again, alliances. Two, the importance of the U.S.-China relationship. And again, Xi Jinping is a different kind of Chinese leader. He's collected power in his own hands. The traditional bureaucracy that we've followed closely, the State Council and the Foreign Affairs divisions, they are not as involved in foreign policy and national security. Decision-making is much closer to the president, much more secretive, much more difficult to penetrate that black box, much more personalized than ever before. It means that the personal diplomacy between the two leaders and other leaders and Xi Jinping is much more important than in the past. The third component of strategy is to recognize that the arena that we've done less in regionally than any other is Southeast Asia. And understanding that the real pivot or rebalance is not so much between Europe and the Middle East and Asia, but much more between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. We need to focus much more constructively on ASEAN as an institution and the key countries that make up ASEAN. So I'm very bullish, as I said, about the relationship in the Philippines. We've seen a remarkable effort to go at issues related to corruption. I believe that we are finally getting over some of the paternalistic challenges of our complex history between the people of Washington and Manila. I believe Vietnam and the United States have the potential to get over our own history, recent history, to develop a closer set of circumstances. And I think Vietnam now understands quite clearly what it's like to be alone on the international stage, and it's not very pleasant. And so I think they're looking to develop closer ties with other countries, but it does not end there. If you made a list of the countries that were most important to the United States, that we weren't even knowledgeable of their importance, Indonesia would be on that list. Engaging the new leader in Indonesia about reform, economic engagement, extraordinarily important, and also the opening in Burma and Myanmar, despite all the many challenges domestically. So ASEAN and the countries within it are a critical third component in this. Fourth, and again, this goes deeply against Democratic Party orthodoxy. I don't want to out Frank, but we are in a minority in our own party. The most important thing that the United States can do in the next year or two is to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We can do everything wrong in Asia, American rudeness, missed meetings, whatever. And if we get the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we get a passing grade, right? That's how important it is. If we do everything right in Asia and don't get TPP, we still don't get a passing grade. That's how important it is. And others are saying, well, we've got to maneuver, and it's not clear we can get it. Let's not create a level that we can't get, that we will fail and then lose. It's too late for that. It's too late. We're out on the ledge. We're out on the diving board. There's no going back. We've got to get this done. And I will tell you, one of the things that I'd like very much to see is a conversation continuing between the United States and Taiwan about next steps associated with our own economic engagement, despite the difficulties that we've had historically on a variety of ranch products. It's extremely important that we talk about the economic and commercial relationship between the United States and Taiwan. So the commercial dimension and the follow-on issues associated with TPP, Asians are looking for the United States to be open, engaged in the region, and we need to recognize the only way that we're going to get back some of the jobs that we lost in 2007 and 2008 is through strengthening American services and exports of goods into Asia, the fastest growing middle classes in the history of the planet. Fifth, we are in the midst of a profound transformation of our military engagement. I'm very grateful to see my friend Ash Carter, who understands deeply what's going on in Asia, assume this role. There is too much focus on the limitations of the budget. The truth is, we have the capabilities, we have the money. What is needed is a strong, conceptual civilian hand that helps our services get over some of their rather narrow parochial interests to construct a multi-faceted engagement across the region. More dispersal of our forces, creating operational concepts that link the Indian with the Pacific Ocean, a recognition that we're going to have to cooperate more with partners in Asia, joint facilities with our partners, a recognition that this is the way forward for the United States and the Asia Pacific region. It will take a long period of time, but the steps that we've begun in Australia, some of the work in the Philippines suggests that there is an understanding of what's going to be necessary as we go forward. Last two, ladies and gentlemen. We're in the process now of building real institutions in Asia. A few years ago, when we went to institutions, it was about dressing up and putting on dancing exhibits at the ASEAN Regional Forum. That's not the case anymore. Some of the most high-level, high-wire diplomacy I've ever seen now takes place in advance and during the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. These are fledgling institutions that matter deeply. They're setting the scene for values, for discussions around shared goals and opportunities. And I will tell you that they serve as a kind of dynamic that animates the fundamental conversation that is taking place between the United States and China. Essentially, and I've done a lot of diplomacy in recent years with China, what we are essentially trying to do is to enlist China in a 21st century discussion in which Chinese friends work with us on sustaining the elements of the operating system that have been so very good to China for the last 50 years. Open and free trade, peaceful resolution of disputes, a legal framework that gives confidence to both the weak and the strong, and a general desire to sustain forward progress more generally. Now, it is always unrealistic for the existing state to dictate terms to the arriving state, right? Thucydides tells you that there has to be an adjustment, there has to be a diplomatic engagement as part of what's going forward. And I would tell you that is precisely what the United States and China are engaged in over a long period of time, is understanding what the rules of the road will be that animate Asia as a whole. Our primary focus is on this 21st century conversation. To date, I think Chinese friends have been more focused on what we might describe as a 19th century conversation, trying to enlist from the United States a sense that there are areas that are no-go for us. They want a regional sense of control, very much like the United States had during the period of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the truth is that was then and this is now. And in fact, that kind of regional domination fundamentally is probably not in China's best interests. And it is certainly not in the interests of countries that live in that sphere, or frankly, of the United States. So how we conduct that conversation is going to be important, and embedding it in a multilateral framework will be critical as we go forward. Last, bringing other friends into the region as we proceed in these discussions. Europe has an enormous amount to add. The largest aid and assistance funds available on the global stage do not come from the United States or Australia or China. They come from Europe. Working with Europe to make sure that we're working to promote health and safety and well-being and education in the LMI countries and elsewhere is extraordinarily important and has to be sustained. And I think there's also a deep recognition that one of the most important achievements of the Bush administration was the opening to Iran and ensuring that, to India, and that India's role in the Asia-Pacific region has to be sustained, and that Prime Minister Modi, his desire to look east, like his predecessor, has to find common cause across Asia as a whole. Now, in conclusion, there is a strong role for Taiwan to play. I believe in the last several years, I won't go into detail, but the intensity of the unofficial diplomatic engagement between the United States and Taiwan has increased dramatically. And I believe that is in the best interest of all concerned. And I also believe that we have taken steps that have addressed the outmoded qualities of some of the frameworks that we've inherited for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. I will tell you my own personal view is that one of the most important things that the United States can do is show Taiwan the respect and the face that it deserves. It should not be shunted to the side. We should not consider engagement with them something that we cannot highlight. It is perfectly consistent to have a good relationship, to work constructively to build a strong partnership with China, but at the same time show Taiwan friends respect and public engagement. So I'm extraordinarily committed to this, and I think it's important. What I'd like to do is to see that to continue. I'd like some stability in U.S.-Taiwan relations under any circumstances, and certainly forward progress in Taiwan Strait-related engagement between China and Taiwan. Ultimately, what I'd like to see is a degree of diversification with respect to Taiwan's role in the region. Taiwan has built much deeper ties with China in the last 5 years. We support that. We support that. But we'd also like to see, and that's one of the reasons we're so pleased to see so many Japanese friends, stronger ties between Taiwan and Japan, Taiwan and Korea, Taiwan and the Philippines, Taiwan and India and other countries in the world. And frankly, one of the things that we are committed to doing is to ensure that not only does Taiwan receive the appropriate face with respect to engagement with the United States, but it is allowed and is accepted to play a role in the critical endeavors internationally. Taiwan's role on understanding safety issues of flight, on nuclear energy, its role is extraordinarily important, and I think it needs to be allowed to exert that role in a way that is responsible and supports the community of the Asia-Pacific region. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say that we have our work in store for us. We need to build stronger ties between Japan and South Korea, a situation that is extraordinarily difficult for us. Our two best friends in Asia really at loggerheads. We must exert ourselves to try to build deeper ties between. We must see these two bilateral relationships take on a trilateral set of dimensions. We must work to ensure high-level diplomacy in Southeast Asia. Inviting Southeast Asian leaders to the United States for a summit would be extraordinarily valuable. Recognizing that in the short term it's necessary to take steps that suggest our unhappiness with Russia, but over time, in the Asia-Pacific region, we need to see that Russia diversifies its engagement in the region and not just simply through China as a whole. We must continue to take steps to prepare for uncertainty on the Korean Peninsula, and as importantly as anything else, continue to show up. As much as strategy and thinking strategically is important in Asia, the most important thing for the United States to do is just showing up. I'm grateful that I showed up today, and I'd be happy to take questions or comments or challenges going forward. Thank you very much. Your active participation and engagement. And I will tell you, many friends on the DPP side, I believe in Taiwan, and I believe in your political system, and I believe that whoever wins fairly an election, the United States is going to be fully committed to working with, and I don't see anyone in the United States that takes a different view. And so we have strong ties across the political aisle. To be honest, what we would like to see, it's not up to us, is that a degree of what we call at the water's edge, issues that unite the two parties, that they say, look, we have our differences, but here is an area that we must work together on. And we'd like to see more of that in Taiwan. We see less of it in the United States than we've had in the past, but we'd like to see it in Taiwan going forward. I think it's very important that no outside forces in China, the United States, or anywhere else play a role to influence the fair expression of democratic engagement in Taiwan. And so, look, we will watch and celebrate the process in Taiwan, and we will be prepared to work with whoever prevails. And that is not a democratic view, and it is not an isolated view. It is a shared view, deeply held across the political spectrum of the United States. I'll take a couple more questions.
Mr. Gu.
Mr. Cook.
Yeah. 我用中话讲，你跟我话一行吗？Mr. Campbell, I welcome you.
Thank you.
From the bottom of my heart. 但是我不会讲英文的啊，刚刚讲几句话可以啊。我想问这个 Mr. Campbell 两件事，一件事呢，就是我看美国对台湾的呢，一个啊就是 status quo， 还有一个呢台湾关系法。那台湾关系法呢，我曾经啊说台湾关系法是 just a piece of paper。非常抱歉的，我非常没有礼貌的，但是这个是我的真正的感受。还有一个呢，就是自从 Kissinger 定了这个对中国台湾的政策，已经差不多要50年了吧？啊，已经要50年了。那这个刚刚Mr. Campbell 也讲很多对台湾的这个他的想法、他的观察，但是基本呢，是不是还是要求台湾呢要 status quo？ 我们已经忍受了半个世纪以上了，现在那中国的状况也变了，我们也很大的变化。那么对这个 status quo，Mr. Campbell 的这个他的看法怎么样？
As the Taiwan relations. First, I'm sorry to say that I've long said that the Taiwan's relationship was nothing but a piece of paper. Forgive me for saying that. To set a tone for U.S. policy toward China more than 50 years ago. So, like I said, a lot of things has been changes dramatically. So I would like to know your new definition of the status quo between Taiwan and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the question. I'm going to take one more, but yes, please, sir.
I'm the former past President General Secretary, and now is the Secretary General of the United Nations Alliance to promote Taiwan to join the United Nations. In the Christian faith, I think it's very important. No, China try use the title peace, the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, but no justice. Always claim Taiwan is part of China, province of China. This is not only, we cannot maintain status quo. Taiwan should be a member of the United Nations and international community, but we are isolated, apartheid from the United Nations and international community. So long time, this kind of injustice. How no justice, no peace? How can we maintain the peace and security in the East Asia? And I always say, Taiwan become a big broken hole of the peace and security of East Asia because we're isolated. Please, the government of the United States, speak out for Taiwan. And we need to improve as a sovereign country and to be a member of UN and the international community. We can contribute the peace with justice to the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you. So to the first question, I will say respectfully, I have a different view about the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. I think it is the most, the proudest act of congressional diplomacy of modern times. And it has animated and created the context for the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And I think it has led to critical conversations between the executive and legislative branches about appropriate steps. Lots of tension, lots of difficulty. But if you look at it from 100,000 feet down, it has created a context for engagement that I believe almost now 35 years of experience suggests that it was quite successful. So I respectfully, sir, I just have a different view, and I think it is important. I believe that there are parameters in it that have to be reformed and updated, particularly in terms of the kinds of engagement between the United States and Taiwan to address some of the critical issues that were described. I do believe that Taiwan sometimes experiences a degree of isolation and a lack of strategic respect that is problematic. And so I think it is important to treat Taiwan internationally with respect and to allow it to play an important role as it sees fit, given all it has to offer commercially, politically, and strategically. And I believe that that can be done within the context of an improving relationship between China and Taiwan, as we've seen. The truth is we use the term in the past a lot, the maintenance of the status quo. But in fact, what we have seen in the last 7 or 8 years is the dramatic change
in the nature of the relationship between China and Taiwan. And much deeper ties, much deeper tourism. I respect the fact that there are enormous interests from China represented in Taiwan. To the gentleman who asked that question, that is not, your situation is not unique in Taiwan. We see that playing out across Southeast Asia and in other countries in the world where we've seen dramatic Chinese investment. And that is one of the reasons why democracy, open discussion, transparency is so important in terms of commercial and other kinds of engagements on the part of China. Ultimately, my own personal view on this is that China and Taiwan are in the midst of the most dynamic set of relationships that we've seen across Asia. The only thing that is comparable is the increasing ties between South Korea and China, two countries that have had very little to do with each other until quite recently. We support that set of engagements just as we support an improving relationship between China and Taiwan. But ultimately, the path and pace and context and content of that diplomacy has to be determined not by outsiders like us, but by the people of Taiwan and China, ultimately. And so when our friend in the back was saying that the United States opposes Taiwan, quote, quote, joining with China, our primary interest is in ensuring that the will of the Taiwan people is effectively represented, as President Clinton articulated in the late 1990s, in the diplomatic process without coercion and without threat of retaliation. We want a process of economic, commercial, people-to-people discussion and diplomacy between China and Taiwan that serves the interests of both sides. And I will tell you, I spent a lot of time with Chinese interlocutors, many of whom have engaged with Taiwanese over the last 10 or 15 years quietly. And that interaction has changed them. They have a different view of Taiwan than they did before. And in fact, many of them have come away with a deep respect for how Taiwan has remembered its culture, not only the culture of the indigenous people, but the culture brought across the Taiwan Strait. And I think they respect many aspects of what Taiwan has achieved. And so ultimately, when I look at the challenges in Asia, just enormous challenges, I have to say I'm quite pleased and generally optimistic about what Taiwan and China have been able to accomplish over the last several years. Now, that may not be what you want to hear. Of course there are problems, and of course there may be attempts to influence your democracy, but ultimately it will be up to you to sustain that and to ensure that the appropriate questions are asked and that the process and pace of engagement with China is undertaken in such a way that it is supported by the Taiwanese people.
Okay, thank you very much. Because of the time limitation, in fact, we already late 20 minutes of the conference. So, but we appreciate it very much. Please join me to appreciate
是，然后大家都说双喜而已，他不是都已经讲了。